Let's record this. There we go. We are on page 423 of the Practical Tanya. If you're looking inside, it's section, it says in the book section 5. I'm pretty sure it's actually a section 6, but we'll keep it. Section 5, but there may be 2 section 5s in this chapter, so just be aware of that. We're on 423 of the Kindle. If you're looking on the screen, that's perfect because you will have the page as I share the screen. We're talking about the power of the mitzvah, the power of the deed, the power of the speech, how that's actually the purpose of it all, the comfort for the Beinani, for the intermediary, the middleman, the intermediate person, the in-betweener, as the Tanya over here likes to call him. So please follow along inside. We're gonna have an ambitious goal to try to cover a lot of ground today. We'll see how it goes. So buckle up, follow along. Section 5, the importance of charity, tzedakah. Based on the above, we can appreciate why the sages praise the virtue of charity to a very, very great extent, saying that it's equivalent to all the other mitzvahs put together. So when you do charity, if you were on a scale and you see charity on one side and you see all the mitzvahs on the other, the charities would be equal on the balance as all the mitzvahs put together. The mitzvah of Shabbat and the mitzvah of Tefillin and all the offerings offered in the temple would be equivalent to one charity, to the mitzvah of charity. And across the Jerusalem Talmud, it's simply called the mitzvah. So that we know there's a Babylonian Talmud, which is much more commonly studied. In fact, I actually have the Babylonian Talmud right here in front of me. I study it daily. But the Jerusalem Talmud is also a very important Talmud. Throughout the entire Jerusalem Talmud, whenever it talks about a mitzvah, it's actually referring to charity. A default mitzvah is charity, without any further clarification. Since it was normal to refer to charity simply as a mitzvah because it's the most significant of all the practical commandments and it surpasses them all. For, as we have seen, the purpose of all the mitzvahs is only to elevate the energizing animal soul to God, being that the animal soul is the active force that powers their observance. And it's the animal soul that becomes immersed in their observance, resulting in the animal soul being absorbed in the blessed infinite light, which is dressed in the mitzvahs. So just to summarize, we know we have the soul and the body. The body is enclosed, the soul is obviously enclosed in the body. It has the godly soul and the animal soul. We already established that the godly soul on its own doesn't need any elevation. The godly soul is godly. The whole purpose of it coming into this world was to elevate the animal soul. But here's the beauty, that the animal soul's participation in the practical mitzvahs, it elevates the animal soul and the energizing force, and it's part of the world that it's doing the mitzvah with. So the mitzvah that surpasses the rest of them is the mitzvah of charity. And this mitzvah of charity is elevating the animal soul, elevating the body, and elevating the energy with which the money, the charity is being given through. Back inside for bottom paragraph in the Kindle, and if you're looking in the book, it's already 423 still, right? The bottom paragraph. And you have no mitzvah through which the energizing animal soul is immersed to a greater extent than the mitzvah of charity. Because with other mitzvahs, which momentarily engage just one part of the body, only one component of the energizing animal soul is immersed in them. And this is only at the moment when each mitzvah is observed. But with charity, when a person gives from money earned through his hard work over an extended period of time, the result is that all the powers of his energizing animal soul that were immersed in the manual labor or other activity by which he accrued these funds are elevated through the charitable donation. So all of his energizing animal soul is elevated to God, and not just one component of the soul, as is the case with the other mitzvahs. So just to summarize, I think this is a very important component, that the mitzvah of charity, it's not only a one-off, a drive-through mitzvah, When you do any other mitzvah, it's that moment you're involved in the mitzvah. And it also, it's the energy of that time. But when you earn your hard-earned labor, your money, all of that energy that you put till you got that paycheck, and now you're giving from the top a percentage, you're giving charity from that. All that is energized, the energizing animal soul is being elevated through that giving of charity. Just interesting to note that with Hanukkah, the tradition is actually not to give gifts. That's actually taken from the Goyish holidays. The mitzvah, or I don't know if it's not a mitzvah, but the tradition is to give gelt, to give money. Hanukkah gelt. And the reason is because we're trying to educate our children in the mitzvah of charity. And when money is given, they have to be the one to divide charity from that. So it's actually about giving money. It doesn't have to be large amounts, but it's not about the gifts. It's about teaching the children to give tzedakah, which we increase during the holiday of Hanukkah, especially because if you take the word Chanukah, it comes from the word chinuch, which means education. Hanukkah is a time of education when we are educating our youth in this important mitzvah of charity, which, like we said over here, surpasses the rest of them. However, back inside, this argument seems to make sense only if a person earned his money by working hard. What if he inherited it, or he won the lottery, or he got a nice stipend of Hanukkah geld? He didn't work hard. What is he elevating in the process of the charity? And even if a person who doesn't work to earn money, which means that he didn't immerse his animal soul into the activity, right? Because it didn't take him a lot of effort. Nevertheless, since the money could have been used to purchase food and drink that will keep his energizing animal soul alive in his body, it follows that by giving away some of that money, he's giving his soul's life to God. And that's why our sages of blessed memory taught that charity brings close to the time of Mashiach, to the final messianic redemption. Right? Mikarevet tagu'ula. Because through one act of charity, you elevate a lot of the energizing animal soul. Many powers and components of the animal soul, which you wouldn't have been able to elevate, even with several other practical mitzvahs, practical commandments. So just to summarize this last point, the question is, what if you win the lottery or you got an inheritance? So your animal soul didn't have a lot of energy that it was putting into earning that money. How are you elevating it? Why is the mitzvah of charity so special then? So he's explaining because you could have used that money to indulge yourself for your own food and drink. So he's not saying over here not to buy food or drink. Of course, you have to live, but you could have pampered yourself the extra mile. And instead, you're choosing, you know what? I want to be able to give charity. I want these children to have shoes on their feet. I want to make sure these children have what to eat. By you choosing to do that, you're taking what energy the animal soul would have indulged in, and instead it's going to charity. That itself is the mitzvah that continues to surpass the rest of the mitzvahs. Section 6, back inside. 3 spiritual virtues of Torah study. So till now, this past section, we're talking about the power of charity, the mitzvah of charity, how it surpasses them all. But now, as we go inside, Torah study was also praised by the sages as being equal to all the other mitzvahs. Let's see how. How does it square with the argument in our chapter that mitzvahs of action further the purpose of creation to the greatest extent? So is it Torah study, which is more of a spiritual mitzvah, or the argument we've been making for the past few weeks or months that action is the greatest? Torah study is not a mitzvah of action. So make up your mind. So the Alter Rebbe is going to try to reconcile this seemingly problem that in one place it says Torah study outweighs them all. But over here, we're obviously expressing the importance of practical mitzvahs like charity. And while our sages of blessed memory said that the study of Torah is equal to them all, by the way, for those that do their daily prayers in the Birchat HaShachar, in the morning blessings, after we do the blessing on the Torah, we say Al Divrei Torah, and then we do Asher Bachar Banu Mikol Amim, we do the priestly blessing, and then we end that section with Elu Dvarim. These are the measures, these are the things that have no measure. And it says visiting the sick, supporting a bride, escorting the dead. But it ends by saying the Talmud Torah, the study of Torah, outweighs them all, is Keneged Kulan. So that's what he's quoting here, that the study of Torah is equal to them all. So how does this square up with the idea of practical mitzvahs being the most important? So that's what he's going to ask now. To all the other mitzvahs put together, this poses no contradiction to all the above. Because the sages taught this about Torah study to point to a particular virtue. The Torah study is carried out with thought and speech, which are the inner garments of the energizing animal soul. Meaning the way Torah study is studied, the virtue of it is that it's carried out through your thought and your speech, which are the inner garments of the energizing soul. The sages were suggesting the following. The study of Torah is equal to them all in terms of its ability to influence the inner garments. Practical mitzvahs, on the other hand, are the most powerful at elevating the outer garment of action. So just to explain something over here, we know that thought, speech, and action are the garments of the soul, which means it's the behavior, our action, our speech, and even our thought. What we think about and what we fantasize, it affects the way we are going to act on it. It starts with our thoughts on it, and then it goes to our speech, and then into our action. But if you want to divide the garments, the thought, speech, and action, there's something known as the inner garments and the outer garment. What we think about, and even what we speak about, is more something from within us. It's more inner. The action is something that's outer, it's something that it's expressed outside of us. So the Alter Rebbe is saying here that there's no contradiction between what the sages tell us in the Mishnah, that the study of Torah outweighs them all, to what we're explaining in the past sections of this chapter, that practical mitzvahs outweigh them all, because it's actually talking about two different parts of the garments. One is talking about the inner garments, what's affecting our inner garments the most, what's cleansing our thoughts, Torah study, what's cleansing our speech, Torah study. But when it's coming to the outer garments, what has the biggest effect on the action, which is the outer garment, that's practical mitzvahs. That's elevating our outside garments. Let me just grab that question. If you are in an area with others and are trying to be quiet and cannot speak when studying, moving your lips still count as action. Yeah, absolutely. Yes, it does. Okay, so I hope that maybe he's going to continue to explain this a little bit, but just the general idea that Torah study is the strongest effect on our inner garments, which is our thought and even our speech. The Tanya now suggests a second unique advantage to Torah study, which led the sages to declare it as equal to them all. So number one, the advantage of Torah study is the effect it has on our inner garments. But here comes another effect of the power of Torah study and another advantage. We're on top of the next page in the Kindle, and we are in the middle of 425. And another advantage of the mitzvah of Torah study is that not only the inner garments, but even the klipas noga powers of chachma, bina, and das in the deep core of the energizing animal soul are actually absorbed into the realm of holiness when Torah study is carried out in depth, engaging the mind. This notion that the deep core can be elevated to God seems to be a departure from the Tanya's general emphasis that the Beinoni can't transform the deep core of his animal soul. So let me just first explain what we're about to share. So because some of this we've been studying for so long, but it's been we took a little break of this topic. So let's just refresh our memory. We know that we have a godly soul and we have an animal soul. Each one has a set of 3 cognitive energies and 7 emotional energies. The way we explained it from chapter 3 is it was the mother or the parent and the child. The way we think, which in Hebrew was our chachma, bina, and dat, which is our chabad, our chachma, bina, and dat, our inquiry, our cognition, and our recognition, or in simple English, we explained it as our wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. That affects our emotions, our feelings. And good morning, Maddie. Great to see you. Happy Hanukkah. That affects our feelings. So now what he's trying to bring home is that when we study Torah, it's having a deep effect on our ability of the functioning of our mind, on the cleansing of the Chachma, Bina, and Das. So till now, we're talking about the mitzvahs and also the Torah study as it has an effect on the garments of the soul, the way our action comes out, or even the way our speech and our thoughts are. But now he's explaining the other value, the other virtue of Torah study is the effect it has on our deep core of our cognition, of our mind faculties, of our chachma, our bina, and our das are truly affected by the virtue of Torah study. We all know that when you could connect with someone on a level of thoughts, you're able to understand each other philosophically or psychologically. There's something very deep going on there. So when your mind is occupied and immersed in Torah study, it's having a deep level effect internally inside your mind. So when the sages in the Mishnah tell us that the Torah study is equal to the rest of all the mitzvahs, he's explaining what that means is because when we study Torah, it's having a deep effect inside our mind. That was the advantage that he's saying now. So far, just to summarize, so far, let's just summarize the section. We know what we've been studying up until now is the power of action. The mitzvahs have the greatest effect. The Alter Rebbe here specifically identifies the mitzvah of charity. Charity surpasses all the rest of the mitzvahs, to the point that in the Talmud, when it just says the mitzvah without identifying which mitzvah, and there's many of them, there's 613 of them, but when it just says the mitzvah, it's referring to charity, because that outweighs, that's balanced, equal to the rest of all the mitzvahs. So the Alter Rebbe was bringing home the point of the power of a mitzvah, especially charity, because the energy that the animal soul has of earning that money is now being used for a mitzvah, so that's elevating, because remember we said the godly soul on its own doesn't need any elevation. It's all the elevation going on of the animal soul, the body, and the energy of the animal soul. And we said even if you would have gotten a big inheritance from Uncle Harry, so you didn't really earn the money, so there's not that much energy that you put into earning the money that you're elevating. But still, you could have utilized that funds for your own indulgence. And instead, you're using it for feeding the poor, for charity. So instead of indulging yourself, you're giving. So that itself has an incredible power of elevation for the animal soul. So that was the first section we studied today. But then we asked, wait a minute. Over here, we're saying that the practical mitzvahs like charity is the gold. That's the whole purpose, which is the comfort for the Beinoni. But elsewhere, we learned in a Mishnah that Talmud Torah, that study of Torah, is higher than the rest of the mitzvahs. So which one is it? Torah study is more spiritual, is more inside me. Mitzvahs is more outside me. So which one is it? That's the ultimate. So he says it's not a contradiction, because the Torah study has the power on the inner garments. It's cleansing my thought and my speech more. Mitzvah, practical action-based mitzvahs, is affecting my outer garment, which is my action. So one virtue of the Torah study was the effect it has on my speech and my thoughts. Another virtue of the power of Torah study is the effect it has on my inner, my mind, the inner core of the soul, which is the Chachma, Bina, and Das, are specifically affected in a positive sense when we study Torah, which means when I am immersed in studying the laws of the Torah, it doesn't even have to be practical Torah study. It could be esoteric parts of the Torah that never happen. Even when I study those, it's funny, right now, like I showed you before, on the table, I have a Talmud that I study with a small group of guys on Tuesdays. And the laws we're studying, it's It's talking about ox goring and falling and tripping over other oxen and doing a bunch of damages, and how much does it have to pay? We don't live with oxen in our backyard, so why is this so relevant? But when you study these laws, the effect it's having on the deep core of my mind is that it's elevating it. It's to the highest degree that no mitzvah could accomplish. But that's more inside of our chachma, bina, and our das, which I think, as he's about to explain, is connecting us with the infinite light of God. So let's see that inside now. So let's just go back to the second paragraph from the top of the Kindle, or the bottom of 425 if you're looking in the book. This notion that the deep core can be elevated to God seems to be a departure from the Tanya's general emphasis that the Beinoni can transform the deep core of his animal soul. So over here, we're saying that when the Beinoni learns Torah, he's having an elevation in his Chachma, Bina, and his Das. But for many, many chapters, we've been explaining that the Beinoni can't be perfect. He could just do perfect, which means he can't change his Chachma, Bina, and his Das. The way he thinks about something, he can't change his inquiry, the way he's wired to think. He could just change his garments. But over here, we're saying that through Torah study, he does elevate his Chachma, Bina, and his Das. So how does that work? So he's going to explain now. And while we have argued above that in the case of Beinonim, the in-betweener, their deep core emotional powers of chesed, which is kindness, gevura, which is discipline, and tiferes, which is compassion, it can't be transformed by them to be holy. That doesn't mean to say that they can't transform their chachma, bina, and das through Torah study, because the negative energy is stronger in the emotional powers of chesed, gevura, and tiferes than in the intellectual powers of chachma, bina, and das, which prevents the emotional powers from being elevated. Because, as is known to Kabbalists, the emotional powers of Klippa are more successful in sucking energy from the realm of holiness. I think you're going to love this part. I'm just going to read one more paragraph, and then I'll explain this. When we stated above that the deep core of the Beinoni's animal soul can't be elevated to God, that was largely true of the emotional faculties. But the intellectual faculties of the deep core can be transformed. And that happens during Torah study. That's another reason why Torah study is equal to them all, because it affects the deep core in a way that no other mitzvah does. So this is, I think, a revolutionary part of Tanya. What we're saying is the power of Torah study, like what we're doing right now, friends. We are studying Torah together. When we are studying Torah, it's having it's causing an elevation in the deep core of our intellect, our chachma, our bina, and our das, which is the acronym of Chabad, which is the inquiry, the way we inquire about something, the way our cognition is, and the way we recognize something. It is affected and elevated through the study of Torah. But this seems to fly in the face of what we've been studying before, that a Beinoni could only change, could only discipline and control their garments, which is their behavior, their outer part, their thought, speech, and action. But we can't change our feelings. We can have feelings towards something, we just don't act on it. That's a Beinoni. We could have a thought about something, but we just don't follow that thought, that pop-up. We don't open the door for that knock. But he's explaining something here that's incredible. That the Beinoni, while you're right, the Beinoni can't change their feelings. That takes meditation. That's a much longer process. So the feelings of our heart, the Beinoni doesn't really change. But the Beinoni can have a change. The Beinoni could affect, by way of Torah study, the mind's intellectual faculties. So the Chachma, Bina, and a Das of a person is much more likely to be elevated in the Beinoni than his feelings. How could his Chachma, Bina, and Das be elevated? That's through Torah study. So I think this is a very powerful idea, that when me and you study Torah, the effect that it has on our Chachma, Bina, and our Das It elevates it. It has a power to change the way we think about something, the way our mind is wired to recognize something, or to the ideas that come in our mind will be more spiritually based by way of Torah study. Whereas our feelings of our heart are not as easily changed by the Beinim. So the power of Torah study, here's number 2 virtue of Torah study. Number 1, it affects our inner garments, which is our speech and our thought. But number 2, it's also having an effect on the deeper core of our soul, which is the Chachma Bin and Das, the intellectual faculties of the soul. Not as much on the emotions of the soul. I think it's a powerful idea. So that's a virtue of Torah study. And I think he's going to give an example soon. Let's see further. The Tanya now suggests a third unique advantage to Torah study, which led the sages to declare it as equal to them all. So again, remember, the Mishnah says that it's equal to them all, Torah study is. So here comes a third virtue, and a further quality, most important of all, by which Torah study is superior to all other mitzvahs, can be gleaned from our earlier citations of the Tikkunei Zohar, which is the Zohar, which is the Kabbalistic book, that the 248 positive mitzvahs are the 248 organs of the king. For just as with the mortal man, by way of example, there's absolutely no comparison or similarity between the life energy in his 248 limbs and the life energy in the brain. Namely, the intellect, which is divided into 3 components of Chachma, Bina, and Das. So just like when it comes to a person, he has 248 organs, life energy, limbs, and you can't compare them to the energy that exists in the mind, in the brain. So too, figuratively speaking, can we say of God, although the comparison is obviously an utterly inadequate one, since the physical world is infinitely removed from God, that the light of the blessed infinite light, which is dressed in the practical commandments, is much less than the Chachma Bina and Das of Torah wisdom. Friends, this is a earth-shattering news over here. When we study God's Torah, we're able to connect to God in a much deeper way than by fulfilling God's mitzvahs. We know there's 248 positive mitzvahs. Those, the Zohar tell us, correspond to the 248 limbs of the king. Just like we have 248 major limbs in the person, so too also the Torah tells us that the 248 mitzvahs are connecting with limbs of the king, so to speak. But certainly we could all identify that a neurologist, what he deals with in the mind, in the brain of the person, is much more subtle and more complex than perhaps what a podiatrist deals with. And I'm not putting down one type of doctor or another, just the complexities of the brain is different. So too also with the Torah study, which is coming from the mind of God, so to speak, has a much greater elevation on the person, or in the words of the Tanya here, is connecting more with the infinite light of God than the performance of a mitzvah. Just like the brain has a lot more complexities than the limbs, so too also does the Torah study, which is connecting with God's Chachma, Bina, and Das, is more connected with the infinite light of God than performing a mitzvah, which is connecting with the 248 limbs. So here's another virtue of Torah study, that through our Torah study, we're connecting more with the infinite, we're tapping more into the infinite light of God. Infinite light, which means the light of God that has no limits. How do we connect with that? Through Torah study. So here we explain, and I'm wondering if he's going to give a summary soon. Yeah, he's about to give a summary, so I'll let the Alter Rebbe do it first, and then we'll explain it outside, but let's just cover it inside first. I think we're turning the page here. Here we go on the top. Torah study then surpasses all the other commandments in terms of the spiritual quality of the divine light invested in it. Obviously, the extent to which this light penetrates a person depends on each individual's mental capacity and grasp of the Torah material. Just because you're studying Torah doesn't mean you're fully tapped into the divine light. Depending on your level of study and your capacity to understand will also depend on the level of light that you're able to receive. And even though when he studies a point of Jewish law, which speaks of this worldly phenomena, a person only understands the physical garb in which the blessed infinite light is dressed. Nevertheless, Torah has been compared to water that flows undiluted from a higher level to a lower one. The Torah descended from its sublime setting within God's blessed will and wisdom, and has journeyed downwards one step after the other, down the spiral of spiritual worlds, without suffering any dilution or diminishment at all, as we explained above. So let's just summarize this, and then we'll explain it a little more. To summarize, we have three qualities in which Torah study is superior to all other mitzvahs. A, it elevates the inner garments of your animal soul to a greater extent. B, it can even elevate the deep core of your animal soul in its intellectual faculties only, right? Not the emotional. And C, the quality of divine light in this mitzvah is superior. So just to explain, also I want to explain the water a little more. So just to summarize the three virtues we have about Torah study, when a Jew studies Torah, number one, he's having a deep effect on his inner garments, which at the beginning of the class, we explained the inner garments is our thought and our speech. When we study Torah, we're elevating our thoughts and our speech. Whereas when we perform our mitzvah, it has a deeper effect on our outer garment, which is our action. Number two, the virtue of Torah study affects the deep core of the animal soul. We know, as we explained in chapter 3, that the godly soul and the animal soul has each a set of 10 faculties, 3 cognitive, chachma, bina, and das, and 7 emotional. When we study Torah, the Beinoni is able to have an effect and elevate the 3 intellectual faculties of the animal soul. The Beinoni is, through Torah study, elevating his chachma, bina, and das of the animal soul, which is incredible. And number 3, we're explaining that through the study of Torah, we're tapping into a deeper level of godly light than by performing a mitzvah. Because practically, the performance of mitzvah is connecting us with, so to speak, the limbs of the king. But when we study Torah, we're connecting with the mind of the king. And the mind is much more spiritually elevated than the limbs. And therefore, we're connecting with a deeper source of God's infinite light. The last thing that we studied on this section was cool, just about water. Sometimes we only understand the physical garb of the Torah study, right? Like I gave you the example of an ox goring another sheep or something. There's a practical ramification of that Torah law. So we're only understanding the physical garb of that wisdom of Torah. But Torah is compared to water. Water, if you take a waterfall or just a stream of water, it flows. It's the same water that was on top of the mountain. It's the same water that comes below. It doesn't change. The water is the same water. If anything, sometimes it actually gets more refined on its way down the mountain through the filtering of the rocks and pebbles. But the point he's trying to say is, even when Torah descends low down the mountain from Sinai all the way down, or from heavens all the way down, the Torah doesn't get diminished. So even if we only understand the physical garb of the Torah study, of God's infinite wisdom, but in that includes the wisdom itself. So therefore, there's no diminishment of that wisdom, because it journeys down one step after another, but it doesn't suffer any dilution or diminishment. Okay, we continue now. Section 7, this is a very powerful section about the contrast or the differences between Torah study versus practical mitzvahs. I think it'll sum up a lot of what we're trying to study. Section 7, Torah study versus mitzvahs observance. Despite these 3 unique virtues of Torah study, the Talmud concluded that the practical commandments generally ought to take priority. Just to explain, I'll tell you, I'll tell you just a personal story that happened, but just to explain to you the law. The law is that if you are studying Torah and there's a mitzvah that has to be done, what do? Do you close your book and interrupt your Torah study? to run to do the mitzvah? Or do you let the mitzvah fall on the side and continue studying Torah? What do you say? I'm taking votes. Steve, what do you say? All right, Nancy, what do you say?
I happen to read ahead, and so I know that where I think the Tanya's going, which is if I'm the only one who could do the mitzvah, then I'm supposed to stop to do the mitzvah. But if not, then I'm continue my Torah study.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, Steve, what were you about to say?
I would agree with that.
Okay, cool. So what's interesting is there, in general, there were, I'll just tell you more, let me start with the more particular. There were certain giants of Torah throughout history that they would not stop to do a mitzvah. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, who we celebrate, Robin, if you remember, you actually came, we celebrated with the big barbecue and a bonfire here on Lag BaOmer. He was one of the few that the level of their soul was such that the Torah study that they studied was so deep that they wouldn't actually stop for mitzvahs. So, for example, prayer is a mitzvah. We all stop our study to pray. We stop our study to light a menorah tonight, to the point where we're actually not allowed to study in the half an hour before the menorah lighting, because the law is that we are concerned that we may get so engrossed in our Torah study that we will forget to light the menorah. So therefore, unless you have someone reminding you, stop and study Torah after sundown, stop and light the menorah after sundown, you're actually not allowed to study Torah half an hour before sundown on Hanukkah, because you have to stop to do the mitzvah. So in general, we stop to do the mitzvah. There were selected people throughout history that their level of Torah study outweighed their performance of the mitzvah. But like Shira put in the chat, and Cheryl as well, that general mitzvah outweighs. But just to get a little more particular, like Nancy and Steve were saying, it also depends on the mitzvah. If it's a mitzvah that can be done by someone else, I shouldn't stop Torah study. Delegate the mitzvah to someone else. But let's say the Chanukiah can't be lit by someone else. I have the mitzvah to light it. We say, Asher Kiddushanu b'mitzvotav etzivanu. I was commanded to do this mitzvah. He sanctified me in doing this mitzvah. So therefore, it can't be done by someone else. But let's say visiting the sick, that can be done by someone else. So if you had the choice between studying Torah or asking someone else to visit the sick, you should study Torah and make sure that person gets visited. But if there's no one else that will visit that person, then you have to stop studying Torah. So I remember, just as a 17-year-old, I went to yeshiva, and I studied in Los Angeles. I was actually just there visiting this weekend. I was there on Sunday in the yeshiva in LA, and I got to see some of my teachers, which was very nice. But I remember there was a payphone right outside of the study hall. It's called, in the Beit HaMedrash, in the yeshiva, in the hall where all the yeshiva boys study, there was a payphone. And I was on the phone during the time when I was supposed to be studying. I was on the phone with my mother. I was talking to her because she's 3 hours ahead on the East Coast in Montreal. So I wanted to make sure I spoke to her on that night. So I was in the middle of talking to her. It was like 5 o'clock in LA, 8 o'clock in Canada, in Montreal. And it was the middle of the time when I should have been studying, because we study for a big portion of the day. So the dean, the main teacher, his name is Rabbi Shachat, he just walked over. He didn't even say, Menachem, get off the phone. He just hung up the payphone. He hung up the I don't know what it's called, but the whatever. And I was so mad. I was saying, how could you stop my mitzvah of honoring my mother? I have a mitzvah. He says, you have the mitzvah of Torah study that outweighs your mitzvah of honoring your mother. And I said, what are you talking about? Honoring my mother, no one else could do. So really, the mitzvah, since I can't delegate the mitzvah of honoring my mother to someone else, I have the importance to do it. And that would put the Torah study on the side. So I remember we got into this whole debate, and we opened books and we're arguing back and forth. It was a fun debate, but it still sticks out in my mind all these years later. Which one outweighs the other, and that's really the section over here that we're talking about. And I'll just take the chat. But you don't want to assume someone else is doing the mitzvah. You need to be certain. Absolutely, you're delegating it, right? Absolutely. Okay, so let's see that a little more inside. Okay. Top of the page, second paragraph. Nevertheless, our sages said, the most important thing is not study, but practical observance. In Hebrew, from the Ethics of the Fathers, Loi hamedrish ikar ela ha'maisa. And Scripture stresses regarding the mitzvot, do them today. Meaning that today, in this lifetime, in this physical world of action, the specific emphasis is on practical mitzvahs. And a further proof for the priority of action is the law that Torah study must be stopped to carry out a practical mitzvah, like I just told you, in an instance when nobody else can do it. So what we're trying to understand is, even though the virtue of Talmud Torah, of study of Torah, is so strong, it's unique, but still practical mitzvahs would take priority, unless it can't be done by someone else. The reason for this emphasis on the practical mitzvahs is because the conclusion of the matter is, observe, this is from King Solomon, observe his commandments, for this is the whole purpose of man. And the reason why you were created and why your soul came down into this world. So if you want to know why your soul is here, listen up. Is specifically to make a home for God in the lowest realms, to transform darkness to light, as the Zohar says, and so that the glory of God will fill all the material earth specifically. And glory of God will be revealed, and all flesh will see together that God is speaking, as mentioned above. So just to bring home this point, the practical mitzvahs take priority since they further the purpose of creation to the greatest extent. So if you were to choose between study of Torah or perform a mitzvah, what we're learning from here is the mitzvah performance outweighs the Torah study, even with all the qualities and virtues that we emphasize that the Torah study comes with, that it taps into a deeper level of the infinite light, that it elevates our inner it elevates the inner core of our intellectual faculties, right? Our chachma, bina, and das, and it elevates our inner garments. All those were the virtues of Torah study. But still, the whole purpose of why you are here is to elevate the darkness of the world, is to bring a home for God here, is to bring spirituality into this physical world. How do you do that? Through a mitzvah. So we're going back and forth, but now the summary is that the Torah study is put on the side for the sake of the performance of mitzvah, because that is the purpose of it all. The mitzvah performance to bring godliness into this world and make a home for God. Nevertheless, back inside, if Torah study must be stopped to carry out a practical mitzvah, only in an instance when nobody else is available to perform the mitzvah, it follows that the reverse is also true. This is not so when there is somebody else to do the practical mitzvah. In such a case, Torah study must not be stopped. Not so when there is somebody else to do exactly. When someone else could do the mitzvah for you, like the example of someone else could visit the sick, right? No one else could hear the shofar for you. So you have to hear the shofar. No one else could shake the lulav for you. So you have to shake the lulav. You put down your book and go shake the lulav. But someone else could visit the sick if you're certain that they're going. So over here we see that Torah study outweighs it, because if someone else could do the mitzvah, you don't stop Torah study. This is not, we said that, but if the practical mitzvahs that further the purpose of creation, why wouldn't you stop learning to do a practical mitzvah? If the whole purpose is to bring godliness into this world, for whatever reason, you should stop the Torah study and do the mitzvah. Even though the Torah is nothing other than the clarification of the practical mitzvahs, which makes it hard to understand why you wouldn't stop studying to do a mitzvah. Nevertheless, the sages taught that you shouldn't stop studying in this instance, because Torah is an expression of chachma, bina, and das, of the blessed infinite light. And by studying it, you pull upon yourself the blessed infinite light with more dignity and with incomparably more illumination than the illumination which is pulled through the mitzvahs, which are the mere limbs of the king. So if you like ping pong, the Alter Rebbe is going back and forth, but he's emphasizing different points of the importance of studying Torah and the virtue of performance of the mitzvah. What he's explaining here is that even though we have to, even though that we're explaining that that the whole purpose is to bring godly light into this world, which is through the fulfillment of the mitzvah. If so, the Alter Rebbe asks, why don't we stop? We should stop studying Torah for the sake of any mitzvah. Why, if we could delegate the mitzvah to someone else, we don't stop? Because he said there's something incredible in the study of Torah, which is the infinite light that you pull upon you. So if you have that option, you should get someone else to do the mitzvah and bring the infinite light upon you. In an instance where a practical mitzvah won't be carried out by someone else, you need to stop studying and do the mitzvah, because the purpose of creation is at stake, right? The purpose is to get that light into the world. But if someone else is going to do that practical mitzvah in any case, and the purpose of creation is going to be fulfilled because the mitzvah is going to be done by someone else, then you shouldn't stop studying. That's because through studying Torah, your soul will receive a higher level of blessed and infinite light than if you would have observed the practical mitzvah. And this disclosure of blessed and infinite light through Torah is why Rav Shesha said, "Rejoice, O my soul, for you I have recited scripture. For you I have studied Mishnah," as is explained at length elsewhere. The point of this statement from Rav Shesha, which, by the way, Rav Shesha was a Talmudic giant of Torah in the times that he lived in Israel, in around the 2nd century CE, maybe 3rd century CE, and he was blind, actually, which was amazing. But he was, let me just say this last paragraph, Torah lifts the soul higher, whereas a mitzvah elevates the body more. That is why Rav Shesha said, "Rejoice, O my soul," specifically, in reference to Torah study. So just to summarize this point, the purpose of why we are here is to bring godly light into this world. The light that is brought into this world is more potent, is accomplished more by the fulfillment of a mitzvah. But the blessed and infinite light upon my soul is more by studying Torah. So if you were to choose, you have to do the mitzvah to bring the light into this world. But if you can secure the light coming into this world by someone else, meaning someone else will do the mitzvah, then I should choose to continue studying Torah, because the light that I could tap into on my soul is much greater through the study of Torah than in the performance of the mitzvah. If it's coming from Maddie, if it's coming from an honest place of intention in your heart, wouldn't God favor that? Like you're calling your mother. Oh, good question. Good question, Maddie. It's almost like what I love is, like what Adina, my wife, is very organized, and in her great organization, she was kind enough to give me a list of things that she wants for her birthday. So she gives me a wish list, and she says, "I don't need any of this, but if you're trying to figure out what I want, here is a list of 5 things." So the biggest favor she did is she told me what she wants instead of me trying to figure out. So of course, there's a certain element that it's about the thought that counts. So it has to come from me. So it comes with a nice card and a nice letter, which outweighs the gift. But it was nice of her to tell me what she appreciates. So God already told us what he wants, what God wants, and how to bring the most powerful light into the world. There's a light that we bring through the study of Torah, a connection we make with God through studying Torah, and obviously the light that comes into the world through the practical mitzvah. So of course it has to come from the honest place, and of course the intention of how you're doing it is probably the most important, because I think we've studied this before together, Maddie. When a person does a mitzvah but does it out of rote, does it with almost like a robot, without any genuineness in doing it, how important is that? How valuable is that? Whereas if you do it even a smaller degree, but you do it with true intention and honesty, it's worth a lot more. But at the end of the day, the light that you're bringing through the study of Torah outweighs the light that you're doing in the performance of the mitzvah. So if you're right, if I was doing the mitzvah of honoring my mother with more integrity than I was doing the study of Torah, then you're right. Probably I should stick to the mitzvah of honoring parents. I don't know. I'm just speaking out loud over here. I know it says that when Mashiach comes, we're all going to participate in building the temple. Me and you, we're all going to go to Israel and build a temple. But the only people that are not invited are children. Why? Not because we're worried that the stones are going to fall on them. This is a time of Mashiach. There won't be any tragedies. But what the reason is because their Torah study is more potent than the building of the temple. So therefore, we don't pull them away from their books. Because them studying Torah, God told us the light that they bring into the world through the studying of Torah is even more powerful. I'm just speaking out loud. I don't know if that fully answers your question, Maddie.
I just have a question about the rabbi that just hung up the phone while you were on it.
Yeah.
So obviously he thought he was teaching you and he was doing his business in the world of like trying to lead you in the right way. But isn't there something to be said for, you know, for him noticing and understanding what you were doing, that you were doing a mitzvah, speaking to your mother, and unless it was like a forbidden time that you weren't supposed to, or, you know, just, I just wonder about what that's about as well. Just because he's the senior,
Right.
does that mean that he has the right to just do that to a kid that's like speaking to his mother out of the goodness of his heart? I don't know. I'm just asking.
Right. No. So it wasn't actually at the right time. Like there is, you know, the dinner, like the way it works in yeshiva, you have an hour break for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So this wasn't during dinner time, which was at 6:30 to 7:30 or 6:30 to 8, I think. This was at 5 o'clock when I just wanted to talk to my mother because she was on the East Coast. And by the time, you know, it would have been 6:30, it would have been too late to call her. So I wouldn't call it forbidden time, but I didn't have permission to call my mother then, which, you know, now it sounds ridiculous. But as a yeshiva boy, you're put into a very specific structure, which is good to have that, you know, guidance and rigid rules in place. You know, we had a curfew, we had certain rules that we had to follow, and one of them was the phones are not available, you know, during yeshiva hours. So he did have he was in his rights to do that, but the education he gave me behind that was actually a lot more powerful, teaching me the difference between a mitzvah delegated to another or the mitzvah or not. But at the end of the day, like I think we're learning in Tanya, the importance of Torah study at that moment was a more important light to bring than the honoring the mother. I'm still debating it. I don't fully understand. Just in the context of the Tanya over here, it definitely has that potency that's more powerful.
Basically, you're revealing that you were a rebel. You were a total rebel, exactly. And that's the bottom line.
Totally.
So at the time, did you think that the rabbi's ruling was correct, or did you convince?
No, I yelled at it, like I not yelled, but like I was mad at him. I was offended. I really stood my ground. And he's a very unique type of rabbi. He does things in a unique way, but I love him for it. So, you know, most teachers would just say Menachem, hang up the phone. He didn't even talk to me, just went like that and walked and continued walking. It's a personality of his that I love him for. So I wasn't mad at him, but I was mad at the situation. But it was I learned to love him for it. Need to take
so neither of you convinced the other. Is that what happened? It was unresolved.
No, it was resolved. Let me try to remember. I remember we opened up a lot of different parts to this mitzvah of if you could delegate a mitzvah, and I was telling him that the honoring my mother, I can't delegate to someone else. Right. But he's saying you have siblings that could call during that time, so they could do the mitzvah during those hours. No, I don't remember what the end result. It was for me. It was more the experience. I just
yeah, it's a lot of questions.
But also the respect I got for him, seeing him care to go through the books, even though this is something that was so easy for him to understand. But he was taking the time to, as a little pisher, to explain it to me, and I learned a lot from that experience. I think more than anything.
Rabbi, isn't there a story like this? And the question becomes, you wanted to do a mitzvah, as opposed to saying your mother needed me to call her. I remember hearing a similar kind of story in which the lesson learned was, it was not so much about you thinking about what you wanted to do and how great a mitzvah is to do, but more the consciousness of saying it was necessary if you would have said, my mother needed me to call her. And then your rabbi would have said, fine. It was the focus was about you getting the benefit of a mitzvah. It was all about you. You never mentioned that your mother needed it. And so
that's beautiful.
I remember hearing that same story about Yeshiva Burger being hung up by his rabbi, and the message that I remember from that was that the focus should be on the recipient of the mitzvah.
That's very interesting.
Yeah, not about what you need. Well, that's one of the things you learn. It's not about what you need; it's what do they need. And so I thought, I'm glad that you lived the ultimate test by doing because your mother needed it, not because you wanted to do the mitzvah. And I just found that interesting.
I will love it. And Nancy, sorry, you had something to say? Sorry.
Actually, reflecting, I didn't want to say anything when we were on section 6 because we wanted to get through more, but about this whole idea about the complexity of the brain and how the animal soul, the inner workings, the inner garments of the animal soul are elevated. I just reflected on the fact that this week, as we're studying what Joseph did, first of all, by interpreting the dreams of Pharaoh, how he interpreted them and what he did. A couple things are striking because I'm reading commentary and I'm thinking about it. One thing, when Pharaoh calls him and he says, "You're able to interpret dreams," and Joseph said, "No, God is talking to me, through which I'm able to interpret the dream." So he's, in essence, what I'm learning is, okay, if we are saying everything that happens is because of God, then we're using more of our humility. And then when Joseph says, he doesn't say, "I need to be the viceroy." He is appointed the viceroy. And the reason I believe that he's appointed the viceroy is he said, you need somebody who is wise, who can gather in the grain during this period of plenty. Because when I see the two cows and the two stalks of grain, the healthy and the unhealthy ones, what it's saying to me through God is that we need to, for the benefit of others, the Egyptian people, we need to do something now. And so when I read that and study commentary, what it does to me is it helps me to understand the humility of doing things for community as opposed to just doing things because I feel good about it, but thinking of community. So for me, Torah study, not to argue the points that we're now not arguing, but trying to understand of how study of Torah and doing mitzvah, active mitzvah, how they work with one another. But for me, when I study Torah, I now think about, oh, that's and commentary, that's teaching me more about humility, and that's teaching me more about the power of Hashem. So I just wanted to share that because to me, it's taking what we're learning each week and helping to elevate my inner garments more, not to take away from my mitzvah of helping community or giving to others.
Beautiful. Beautiful. You're getting some nice compliments in the chat also. I'm going to do something uncharacteristic. I'm going to spend a few more minutes overtime, just because I do want to finish this chapter. I think this is like our 5th lesson in the chapter. So I want to be done with chapter 37, the end of this section. So it's pretty short, but we're going to go for it. Here we go, section 8. And if you have to go, no worries, I won't be offended, and you could catch the recording, but I'm going to try to squeeze in section 8. Another virtue of Torah study. So we explained 3 virtues. He's going to give the summary here. Above, we learned that Torah study brings an unparalleled spiritual illumination to the soul. The Tanya now develops this idea further, like Nancy was saying. Now, this illumination of the blessed infinite light, which a person pulls and shines into his soul through Torah study. And since all souls are connected, which I love this idea, we're all connected. So when I pull Torah study on for me, he pulls it upon the source of all the souls of Israel, meaning everyone's benefiting from my Torah study. Namely, the Shekhinah, which is God's divine presence, Knesset Yisrael, source of all the Jewish souls, as will be explained below in chapter 41. This illumination, which comes as a result of Torah study, is called in Hebrew Kriya, as in the phrase, Korei b'Torah, he reads the Torah. Kriya means to read. So this illumination of Torah study in Hebrew is called Kriya. Kriya literally means calling. So Korei b'Torah means that through studying Torah, you call God, so to speak, to come to you, like a man calling to his friend. So Kriya means to read, like the reader of the Torah in synagogue. Like on Shabbat, we read from the Torah. The reader is called a Korei b'Torah, the reader, the Baal Koreh, the reader. So Kriya, which means to read Torah, it also means to call. And he's going to bring sources that calling in Hebrew is Kriya. So when I'm studying Torah, I'm pulling the godly infinite light on me, and I'm also calling to God, so to speak, to come to you. Like a man calling to his friend to come to him, or like a small boy calling to his father to come to him, to be united with him. When a child is calling to his father, Abba, or a friend is calling out to his friend, there's this very strong connection going on there. So when you're studying Torah, which is called Kriya, you're calling out to God and he's coming to you, to be united with him, and not to separate from him and remain alone. Only Torah study, not practical mitzvah observance, is referred to as calling God directly. This is an outstanding quality that places Torah study in a league of its own. And this is the meaning of the verse. God is close to all those who call to him. This is actually from the Ashrei that we sing in our daily prayer. Karov Hashem l'chol karav, l'chol asher yikre'u v'emet. To all those who call to him in truth. This is from Psalms. And truth refers to nothing other than Torah. So when we call to God in truth, which means in studying Torah, God is coming close to us. In other words, sorry, I went a little too fast here. In other words, the second half of the verse, to all those who call to him in truth, clarifies what is meant by the first half, all those who call to him. That the calling to God mentioned in the first half of the verse is specifically via the Torah. The truth mentioned in the second half of the verse, which excludes someone who calls to him not via the Torah. And he merely cries out in prayer, Father, Father. So when you call out to God in prayer, you're eliciting God to listen to you. But when you call out to God in Torah study, God is coming to you. He's coming close to you. And it is in reference to the one who calls to God in prayer and not through Torah, that the prophet bemoans, there is no one who calls by your name, which is from Isaiah. God is being called in prayer, but not by his name, the Torah, as explained elsewhere. In other words, while prayer is also a type of calling directly to God, only Torah study possesses this quality in a truly authentic fashion. With these ideas, an intelligent person can meditate to generate a feeling of immense reverence when studying Torah, the importance of which was explained above in chapter 23. In summary, through Torah study, we connect with God more intimately, whereas through practical mitzvahs, God's presence is drawn into the world to a greater extent. With the combined effect of the Torah study and practical mitzvot, we make a home for God below in the fullest possible fashion. This was an amazing idea. I'm sorry for going fast. So just if I could get one more minute of your time, which I respect a lot, so I'll try to keep it short. We're going back and forth between the importance of Torah study, the virtue of Torah study, and the value of a mitzvah. What we know is that when we do a mitzvah, the light that we are bringing into the world is unparalleled. But when we study Torah, the infinite light that we pull onto ourselves, and by extension of ourselves onto the entire Israel, to the entire Jewish people, is unparalleled. So we kind of want a combination of the two. So if the mitzvah can't be performed by anyone else, that is the priority, because ultimately we need the light to come into the world. Our job is to make a home for God. That's why we're here. And by doing that mitzvah, we elevate our portion of the world. The energy of the animal soul is elevated, and the food and the drink that we use to do the energy for the mitzvah is elevated. And for example, and especially by the mitzvah of charity, we are elevating the hard-earned, whereas any other mitzvah to fill in, or any other mitzvah, it's one part of you that is being connected into that light. But whereas you do charity, it's all your energy that you use to earn money that is all being connected and being elevated. By the virtue of Torah study, if you could do the mitzvah by someone else, not like menorah that you can't have someone else do it for you, or shofar, or matzah. No one else could do that mitzvah for you. But if you could do the mitzvah by someone else, then you should study Torah, because the level of light that you pull from the infinite light on you and onto the entire Jewish people is a level on its own. And just this last point, when you call to God in prayer, God is listening. But you're not calling out God's authentic name. When you call to God in truth, which is what King David says, which we're translating truth. What is truth? Truth is Torah. When you call to God, or in Hebrew, Karov Hashem l'chol karav, l'chol asher yikre'u v'emet, God is close to all those who call out to him in truth. When we call out to God in the method of Torah study, God is coming close to you. It's like when a child calls out to their father wants to do anything for the child. Or when a friend is calling out to his friend, the friend is there to listen, fully focused. So when we call out to God in Torah, in truth, God is coming close to us. So there's a certain element of closeness that exists in the study of Torah that doesn't exist in the prayer. So therefore, we need both. We need the performance of mitzvahs and we need the study of Torah. Both of them combined makes the ultimate home for God. So if you think you could get out of either doing a mitzvah or get out of Torah study, you came to the wrong class, because over here we got to meditate even more on understanding the incredible power and potency by your mitzvah that you can do today, whether it's lighting the menorah tonight or reaching out to a friend that you know is isolated and needs help, or giving charity, or any other mitzvah of putting on tefillin, or whatever it is that you're going to do today, or disciplining yourself from not losing your patience. That is a mitzvah. You're bringing godly light into the world. The skafia. It's one of the main things we've studied in chapter 26. But at the same time, the power and importance of studying Torah outweighs that, because the blessed infinite light that you tap into and pull down onto yourself is much higher and more powerful. Sorry for the delay in getting that out, but we finished chapter 37. All right, everyone, happy Hanukkah. We hope to see you tonight, and God willing, also Sunday evening for the menorah lighting in front of City Hall. Happy Hanukkah. Bye, everyone.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Rabbi.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.